Hi, and welcome to this session of our Media Matters series. This week's guest speaker is Pamela Hutchinson. And Pamela is a freelance writer, critic, and film historian who contributes regularly to publications like Sight and Sound, The Guardian, Empire, Criterion, who's worked for Indicator as well as the BBC, and who specializes in silent and classic cinema and women in film. She's written essays for several edited collections, including recently the excellent She Found It at the Movies, Women Writers on Sex, Desire, and Cinema. And she's also the author of the BFI classic On Pandora's Box and the editor of 30 Second Cinema. She's a guest lecturer at the National Film and Television School and a member of both FIPRESCI, which is the International Federation for Film Critics, and the London Film Critics Circle. She also writes the silent film cinema website, Silent London. Welcome, Pamela, and over to you.
Oh, hello. Was working as a production journalist, so I was sub-editing those magazines as well as contributing to them. After I completed my MA, I found that working on those magazines wasn't sort of the challenge that I really wanted. So I applied for a job at the Guardian newspaper. So for the next 13 years, I was working full-time at the Guardian on production. I started out on the features desk, on various features desks, from sub-editing, laying out pages, writing headlines, to sending off pages and production editing whole sections. I then eventually managed to get myself a job on the website, which was the real aim all along. I joined thinking that it would be a great way to work on the internet, but it took some time, as there is still a bit of a print and web divide in some legacy organisations, I think, which is understandable because people have come to it with different backgrounds. But I did get some chance to work on the website, worked on the redesign of the Guardian website, the current design that you can see there. And then I became a homepage editor on the digital news desk. So by that point, I'd worked on features, I'd worked on culture, and then I did a couple of hard years on the news desk, which was very exciting. And if you ever thought you wanted to be a journalist, working on the news desk will let you know whether or not you really, really do have that news instinct. It's interesting just sort of to say, we'll talk about all the classic film and things that I do, that sort of news sort of instinct kind of stays with you and works with you in your career. So most of the things I'm working on now are feature articles or box sets or curated seasons and things that might seem not very timely. But on Saturday morning, I was having my cup of tea and I got called by the BBC because a classic film star had died, Rhonda Fleming. And so would I go and pre-record a segment for PM later that day? And I did. Because obviously I don't like weekends off, who would? And then first thing Monday morning, someone was asking for an obituary of her. I have actually worked on an obits desk as well, very good job. Just to see that even though I'm working on things that are quite old, sometimes you get swept up into the news cycle. It will be 10 years next month that I have been blogging, which again, I think the word blogging is a little bit old-fashioned. I started the site because I was a bit bored at the Guardian. So obviously boredom is a key factor in me taking on things. I started the site to share silent film listings, but it's interesting, once you start a site, and again, it's a bit like I was talking about having brands, people sort of come to you and say, you're the silent film person, could you write for us about this? Could you write about that? And just after I launched the site, the film The Artist was released and won and was a big hit at Cannes, and then it won a BAFTA. And if ever there was a time to launch yourself as someone who writes about silent cinema, it turned out to be very fortuitous and not planned at all. I have no connections to Miramax, I can assure you. With all these things, it's quite interesting. I can tell that there's lots of different directions that my career could have gone in, and lucrative ones perhaps as well, but it really is cinema that is my passion, and also good writing, and that was something that interested me as an editor as well as a writer, and just a sort of passion for sort of media. I love to see a beautifully laid out website or magazine or newspaper, and you know, I do get caught up in debates about journalistic ethics and what's the right and wrong way to cover things. There's all things we can talk about. The sort of qualification I push at the bottom here is those memberships that I mentioned, that Lise mentioned earlier. These are sort of retrospective qualifications. If you have been working in the field, producing work of a certain quality, you'll get admitted to these bodies, elected or invited or so on. So it's a bit like, you know, it does feel sometimes when you meet people at parties and tell them you're a film critic, they sort of look at you and go, really? Because there's only 3 or 4 film critics that most people have heard of, so they don't believe you're one of them. I don't look like them. Yeah, I can say I am a film critic. I am accredited to the professional body of film criticism, both in Britain and abroad, which does lead to lots of opportunities. So I just wanted to do a little bit of a run through of the kind of things that I write day to day, because it's not necessarily the same kind of piece. So generally, I write features often, historical features often, but sometimes interviews. I've interviewed people like Claire Denis and Greta Gerwig, and that's been obviously a great experience. Interviews not my favourite thing. I think I prefer my subjects dead and easier to pin down, perhaps. But long form written pieces, what we think of as long form is really anything over 1,500 words, which I'm sure if you're writing essays does not feel long. Reviews obviously are a bulk of what I do, whether it's reviewing new releases, which I do a lot of for Sight and Sound and for Empire and sometimes The Guardian, or whether it's box sets and Blu-ray and re-releases and things like that. I write a lot of the essays that go in Blu-rays of classic films. This is one of my favourite jobs. I filed one this morning. I can't tell you what it was, but it involved lots of glamour and fist fighting, and it was a very enjoyable essay to write. I do find film history very interesting. I'm not really an academic, as probably obvious, but that's sort of where I stray from most of the film critics, is that I delve into history. As Lee's mentioned, I have written a couple of books and written chapters for books. That's a slightly different process. The book I've got a book I co-wrote coming out in December, which I started writing basically last Christmas. So that has been really fast. But generally, I mean, I've got an essay and a book coming out this December also, and I think I've been working on that for maybe 2.5 years now, because it's a proper academic book, and there's been stages of reviewing and peer reviewing and proofreading that I don't really quite understand. It's interesting to me what outlets require footnotes and which don't. That's definitely something that I feel you either should be there or shouldn't, but it really depends on the place that you're writing for. Another thing I do, which is quite interesting, which actually ties together a lot of my career, is I produce the weekly film bulletin for Sight and Sound, which, if any of you are on the film studies courses, you may follow, or perhaps you should follow. It's free to sign up for. It's an email newsletter that arrives every Friday, and we started it just in lockdown. So that's quite a fun task, and we'll talk a little bit about that later, but that ties in writing, editing, curating, and a little bit of digital production. It's very sad to say that I used to write a lot of programme notes for screenings of films. Obviously, that's not something that happens too much right now, but it will come back, and it's pretty similar to the essays. And here are some of my specialisms. Apart from modern film, yes, silent film is obviously my passion. Classic film, I wish I'd been here for the Norma Shearer talk yesterday. Stardom, women's film, history, a bit of fashion actually, and literary adaptation, which is the simplest way that I converted my undergraduate into my postgraduate degree. So this is the bit where you know, your friends sort of notice that you've been doing things. You do a bit of media work if you're a journalist in this field. This is definitely something that a lot of film critics do. Broadcast radio and TV, ideally radio, says my shy voice, but I do quite a lot of commenting on things like the Radio 4 film programme. Obviously it was PM at the weekend. I have been asked on today and turned them down. One of these days I'll be brave enough or find something that I'm confident enough in. But it's interesting, it's often pre-recorded. Sometimes you produce something on a little script beforehand, but often it's a matter of getting to the studio and having a live debate with people who you don't know what they're going to bring to the discussion. If you do something like free thinking, it gets quite in-depth, and that can be enjoyable. So it's a bit nerve-wracking. Another sort of media thing would be appearing on Blu-ray extras, just a talking head thing, which we'll talk about later. I have begun to script and narrate some video essays with some production companies recently. It's a whole different skill, and also writing and recording audio commentaries for film, which obviously is a quite in-depth job, with the average film being about 90 minutes. What I've been doing a lot of in lockdown is appearing on my friends' podcasts for free. It is actually a really good thing to do, I think, if you're starting out as a film critic. Some podcasts are paid, that's true. it's a good way to sort of flex your critical muscles and make connections with people and get your words and your thoughts out there. I'd rather appear on a podcast for free than write for free, although we can talk about the ethics of writing for free later if you want to. And yeah, talking heads, if you've filmed sitting in an office like this for a documentary or a TV program, giving your thoughts, there's an art to making sure that everything you say is pithy and self-contained, so it can't be edited into something else, I think. And yeah, this is quite poignant also, but being a film critic, you're often asked to turn up to places, not so much these days, although a lot of this stuff has obviously gone online. Film introductions, I've done at least one film introduction during lockdown on a pre-record and tried to stage my front room suitably for a screening of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which was fun. At least. I give lectures like this one in schools and universities, but I also give lectures in public sometimes. And I think Lisa and I've worked together on events at the BFI South Bank where we're talking about different film stars, and that's always quite interesting. And it's fun, you know, a lot of the people that do that kind of work are more on the academic side compared to where I come from. And I'm sure a person could spend a lot of time being intimidated about what your role should be, but I think it's great to have a different tone of voices in there, and I've always found them quite productive events actually. Likewise, panel discussions, you might be with all kinds of different people. I'm often hosting them too, which is quite fun. I'm hosting a panel discussion in November, which is for the launch of 3 books in the BFI Film Classics season. So if I can remember rightly, it's a discussion that's going to take in The Cloud-Capped Star, Near Dark, and The Empire Strikes Back. And if any of you have considered seeing those 3 films back to back, then you're one step ahead of me. As a journalist, you like to give back, and I do often do print interviews and give quotes occasionally as a silent film expert. I would normally pass that on to someone who I consider more expert, but sometimes I've been involved in a certain project, so that would be appropriate. And another thing you can do in person, and actually I did do this year in person, was take part in a festival jury, which I think of as kind of like live, almost competitive film criticism, where you're watching new films in a week and discussing them with people who you've met for the first time that week, with the aim of giving out a prize. And as you can imagine, sometimes this can be a rather heated discussion, but actually the jury that I was on recently was one of the best and most productive I've ever been on, and it really gave me a new enthusiasm for the form, and we gave prizes to a very worthy film, a few very worthy films, and it really cheered me up no end, I can tell you that. So here's a little bit about Silent London. Silent London, it's fine if you haven't seen this, but this is just to give you a little overview of what it is I do, is a specialist blog for silent film fans, but we try to be quite welcoming to people who aren't. It is pretty much all written and edited by me, but I do have guest posts, and we've got a few certain focuses and so on, like British silent cinema. It just, you know, without trying, that happens to be it. And we do podcasts and so on. There has been a bit of the silent film community is quite strong, but it doesn't always get to meet at festivals, particularly not this year. So it's great to have a site like this. I'll probably skip over that and we can come back to it if anyone's interested in that. Here's a little bit about film festivals, where you go as a critic. This is the terrifying picture of us giving out the prizes in Athens this year with masks and gloves on. Much as it was exciting to be there, it was a little bit strange. If you're going to cover a film festival as a critic, there's a lot to say about getting accreditation, and then also choosing the films that you really think you're going to get value from, that someone's going to want you to cover, that you're going to be able to bring something to. You may be pitching from events that happen at the festival as well as the actual films, and you have to learn some of the tricks about writing reviews quickly, which is again a thing that we can talk about later if you want to ask questions. Here is Weekly Film Bulletin. So this is I mean, it's a lot of work, but it's quite fun in that it's a little bit like making a little movie magazine every week. Don't tell the editor of Sight and Sound I said that. I'm reviewing or collating reviews and recommending films, which is called the essence of film criticism. It's kind of about film criticism more than film. I write an editorial intro every week, and I collate archive material. There's always a classic cover from the magazine's archive, classic list from our poll, and sometimes I collaborate with people like We Are Parable or podcasters who have got a particular field that they are specialist in. I'm going to move on quite quickly because I know we want to have time for questions. This is video essays and audio commentaries, which is, I think, pretty much all film critics do, even if they don't have a kind of historical focus like me. There's especially been a series called BBC's Inside Cinema with short video essays, which I definitely recommend you look at if you're interested in the form or just in film criticism generally. These are just images from films I've used here. There's no hidden message with the scary escape in the fog imagery there, sorry. With both formats, you've got to talk directly to the images. It's not about speaking your speech about the film and letting the images play out. And you really want to make sure that you're delivering sort of carefully targeted bits of information. However, with video essays, the art is really about concision, and you want to let the audience make the connections between what you're pointing out quite often, because that's much more productive. Whereas audio commentaries are all about elaboration, adding value and context. I've written, it's a bit like pointing out that the extra in the background used to be in Stan Laurel movies, or that they've reused a set from another B picture and things like that, as well as the sort of more important film history surrounding the film. Now, I've written a little bit here about writing film reviews. I'm going to skip over the next slide, but I thought I'd have a little bit of Laura here. For me, if you write a film review, it has to have these 4 things: a description of the film, so people know what it's like, and also that's where you can show that you're a sort of fair-minded critic. Even a person who disagrees with your opinion of the film should recognise the description of the film, I think. You should give your opinion. You should in some way say whether you think it's worthy or not. Some people have to do stars, like when I write for Empire, I have to give stars, so that sort of makes the opinion bit a bit blunt. I think you should have an argument for why you think it's good, not just it's an exciting action film, but what is it about this film that really makes it worth your trip to the cinema? And I think it should have detail. Not just because I think it's good practice to back up your arguments for detail, which I'm sure you all know from studying journalism and just studying full stop that it's true, but I think it's really rewarding for readers who have read your film review to then watch the film and recognise the particular things you're pointing out. So, if you say that a film has got well-drawn characters, you can point to something a character does that sort of shows you something about them, whether it's a sort of tick or something they reveal in a conversation. I was going to talk a little bit more in detail about how to write a review for Sight and Sound, because it's quite specific, but I think that might be quite niche for this audience. So I would just sort of skip over to that and maybe turn over to what questions you might have while I just plug another book here very calmly.
Thank you very much for that, Pamela. That was really, really interesting. And I would like to tell our audience, if you have any particular questions for Pamela, I've got a few which I've kind of introduced a Q&A session with, but please do pop those in the chat. And, I'll be very happy to kind of pick up on those and read them out loud. So please do feel free to do that. In terms of questions that I have many, because I just
so excited.
So interesting. I guess my first question, so some of the students that we have in the audience here are taking my module, which is Introduction to Film Criticism. So, they're sort of where we kind of introduce the notion of film criticism, film language, and their first assignment is actually a review. And I really appreciated you kind of outlining some of the things that a review should have. So I just wanted to broaden that out a little bit to, once these students kind of leave university, or even while they're at university, if they have an interest in kind of going into film criticism, which are some of the steps that you think are really useful to kind of lead into a career in that, in terms of, is blogging useful, is podcasting useful, how to find your niche, where to pitch, anything that you can say kind of in that context would be really useful.
I think, this is sort of like the $1 million question, really. I think, obviously, there are things I'm going to say now that might seem incredibly obvious, but actually sometimes these are the questions you need to think about. Obviously, if you bounce out of university and write a letter to the editor of a film magazine and say, hello, I'd like to write reviews for you, you're not offering them much. You're not offering them much to go on or to have faith in, even though you may be marvellous. So I think it's good to have a collection of work that you can be proud of. That's one of the reasons why I mentioned podcasting might be quite good. It's probably quite good to talk through with fellow critics of your own age and experience level of older, and sort of get yourself out there and covering particular topics. Blogging can be good. Obviously, anything you can write, whether it's for student magazines or like local or smaller arts magazines, anything that you can point to and say, I wrote this. I wrote it about something, especially if you can say, I wrote it about something that I'm passionate about. You know, I'm really interested in Korean cinema, and so I wrote about the Korean Film Festival. You know, these are the things I'll have to say about recent developments in this field, and I can back up that I know something about its history as well. You know, really at this point, play to your strengths and have some good work to show. So when you want to pitch a feature on Korean cinema to Little White Lies or, you know, wherever, you can approach them and say, look, here's something that sort of proves I know what I'm talking about and proves I can write well. I think it's important to know that editors are interested in new voices. They really are. It obviously is quite hard to find sometimes. They're interested in new voices. They're interested in people who have particular specialisms. And they are also, and this is so boring, and don't fall asleep while I say it, they're interested in people who will file what has been asked for at the right time, at the right word count. And I know it sounds boring, but people want reliable people, you know, and so if you can prove that you are, you know, you're a professional person who has an expertise, this is the main thing that you want to show people. Lovely writing skill, lots of film knowledge, and a professional person. I really recommend, whenever there's a festival that you can get to, going there and challenging yourself to write as many reviews as possible, whether you're just doing it for your letterbox or whether you're collating them into something longer. You've got to keep responding to films and getting excited about films to hone your skills as a film critic.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, there's kind of lots there to think about. We've got a few questions in the chat, so I'm just going to kind of flag those up now. So the first question is, how long did it take you to get where you are now? Which I know you covered a little at the beginning, but if you could just kind of give us a recap of that.
I mean, I got a job in journalism straight out of university. So you could say, you know, I left university and I got a job on a magazine. I got a job on a magazine where they said, and I cringe, this was 2001, so I cringe to repeat this. The actual advert said, attitude more experience than, more interesting than experience, attitude more than experience. So I did actually have some experience, so I got the job. But yeah, I went full-time freelance 4 years ago, and I started writing on film aside from my day job at The Guardian in 2012. So you could say that it took me 4 years from starting out as writing bits and pieces on silent film for other people, or you could say 6 years from when I started Silent London. It depends what your sort of boundary is, but you certainly, you know, you need to give these things a little bit of time. And, you know, if you're thinking of leaving college and trying to get into film, there's absolutely no shame in getting a job to support that. And actually, I think that working, whether it's working for a film festival or a magazine or for a lawyer's office completely somewhere else, it's all good experience, and it all helps you sort of understand what it is you do and do want to do in your career.
Okay, we've just got a new question popping up actually, which is really interesting. And thank you for that, Pamela. It was really, really helpful, I think. So what advice would you give to someone who wants to create their own blog? And what advice do you have for students who want to get work experience, etc., in journalism? Do you have any kind of advice in that regard?
I mean, I got work experience at Sight and Sound when I was a student by writing letters to the editor or to whoever and saying, you know, I read your magazine, I love cinema, I go to the BFI South Bank, I'd like to work there. There's a scheme, I think, now actually with the place where I did my MA, where you get work experience there. But I think writing letters to people is probably still the way forward, although I suspect they're called emails nowadays. I think the work experience can come in lots of different forms. A lot of volunteerships at film festivals are paid now. Obviously, I know that's not an internship at a magazine, but it's a good way to get lots of contacts and find out what's going on, whether there's somewhere else that you might be able to pitch to. And the other part of the question was about
what advice would you give to someone who wants to create their own blog? Because obviously,
right. Okay.
I do sympathize with that, because I always feel like there's a lot of blogs out there in the world. So what advice would you give?
Well, I mean, that's the thing. There are a lot of blogs out there, and yet it can be really productive and gratifying to set up something, whether it's for your own writing only or for other people's. If you start, I mean, we've all seen blogs that are highlight headline things like random thoughts or, you know, some ideas on film. Whether you call it that or not, you really need to get quite specific about what it is you're going to do. I always say this with web projects, and it's something I learned at The Guardian. It doesn't matter if you change that very specific thing. It still is quite clear. Like, why would I go to your site rather than someone else's? Why, if I saw it on the list of reviews on IMDb, would I think, oh, I might click on that? You know, there's potential that if there's a silent film listed on IMDb and people click on the critic reviews, they'll click on Silent London because they'll think, here's someone who knows about silent film writing on it. So, you know, if you want to write about fashion in mid-century cinema, you know, really focus your blog all around that. And if you start diving into a niche like that, you'll probably find that that is a topic that's relevant all over. I'm always writing about silent film in relation to modern releases. I even, like everybody else, wrote about Tenet on my silent film blog. I'm not too proud. And so really, I think it's about offering something very specific. You know, is it because of you and what you bring to film, your unique viewpoint? Maybe you've worked in the film industry, or maybe you've come from a different country and you're really interested in British cinema, or vice versa. Maybe all you want to write about is classic cinema and how it reverberates in modern cinema, but just make sure that it's quite obvious when people get to your site what they're going to have. Maybe you write 10-word reviews, or maybe you only do podcasts. God, I'd like it if someone cornered a niche in like short podcasts. That would be great. Podcasts are so long, but yeah, I think just try and find something very specific that you can do. Doesn't matter if you change it in a few months, at least you're sort of offering something that people will notice.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's really, really useful. And you're right, sort of often some of my favorite blogs are the blogs that are sort of very targeted, very specific, kind of, you know what their expertise is. That's really interesting. I actually have another question for you, specifically targeted this time to the fact that I've got some students who are going to be writing possibly their first film review very soon. So I was wondering, in a very practical sense, so if you are asked to review a particular film, right? How do you kind of, in a practical sense, tackle that?
Okay.
Obviously watch the film, and what happens then?
Okay, so you need this and this. Okay. I am not actually, oh, this is a terrible thing to admit, the biggest advocate of writing notes in the cinema. I write notes if I watch things at home, but in the cinema I find that I can't read them afterwards, but my brain has told me that I've written it down and forgets it. So, but either way, whether you're writing notes or you're doing what I do, which is sort of stay in a kind of state of high concentration, like a ballerina on stage or something, the whole time memorizing little moments, you want to make sure that you're paying attention to not just the broad plot of the film and what you think, but to details. Always details. And if you know, when you're looking for things to write about later, even if you found the film terribly dull, the opening scene, they almost always mean something with the opening scene. So you pay attention to the opening scene, you pay attention to the ending, you pay attention to what the actors are doing, and try and understand their performances and things like that, which is really hard. So you're focusing all this bit of information, remembering all your quotes, you've got it written down here if you've got any sense, and then you have to look at your word count. And one of the things I often find quite difficult is I sometimes come out of a film with lots of ideas and I realise that I've got 400 words. So you have to sort of chew the film around in your head, and there's two things you're thinking about. What is really your response to it? What do you really want people to know about the film and understand about the film? Is there anything that you can bring to it? Maybe, you know, you've read the novel it's based on. Maybe you've seen several films about this. Maybe it's a world you know something about. But also, how are you going to shape it into the shape that you need it to be? I'm a bit wary of the rapid turnaround review. I think it is always good to cogitate. I think there's a special place in hell for people who make a snarky comment the moment the lights go up at the end of the film. They are the worst people. Well, you know, maybe violent people are worse than that. But yeah, so leave it to cogitate for as long as possible. And I wouldn't often write notes or a kind of plan for a review unless it's long form. I think one of the first reviews I ever wrote for Sight and Sound was the 1,500 word slot, and that I planned out like an essay. But normally I think you sort of know you've got your introduction, you've got a meat in the middle, and you've got a neat sign off. When you look through it, make sure that sometimes I look through work and I just count all the proper nouns. Make sure that you're describing things that actually exist in the world of the movie and not talking generally about things. And you know, leave it for as long as possible before you can send it. I always like to file things first in the morning, but make sure that you're really happy with your argument. There is room in a review in this form of writing for a bit of wordplay, for a little bit of jokes, sometimes for a little stylistic flourish, but you certainly don't want to put them in at the expense of the analysis. That's not the thing. You're not here to make jokes about Star Wars. You're here to tell me whether it's any good. And obviously there are sort of two kinds of reviews really. In Sight and Sound, it's more criticism. I'm sure you're covering all this. So you're giving the film its full context. You're describing it in every single way that you can. If you're writing for, you know, a tabloid newspaper, you are really trying to tell people whether it's worth booking a babysitter. You're trying to tell people whether they should go or not. Is it worth it? Which is a slightly blunter question, but I mean, it can be equally as rewarding to answer. But yeah, you know, with Sight and Sound, you're allowed to sort of roll around your misgivings. Even if you think it's a 4.5-star film, you're allowed to give a full paragraph to the bits that you found imperfect, wanting, retrograde, something like that.
Thank you very much. I especially like what you said there about sort of knowing your, you know, the publication that you're writing for, right? I think that's something that's really important. And I think that was actually very helpful to my students. Thank you.
I say this as someone who I think quite often reviews Empire films for Sight and Sound and Sight and Sound films for Empire. So like I reviewed the new Sally Potter for Empire. This is, you know, and Charlie's Angels for Sight and Sound. So obviously it's something I think about quite a lot.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. I quite like that. This idea that, you know, a film can be kind of a Sight and Sound film or an Empire film and vice versa.
Which is probably a toxic way to think about film, but it can be useful in some ways.
Yeah, no, I think it's sensible in this context. I did have one more question, which is it's something that I've kind of felt before when I'm introducing a film, for example, which I know you've done more of than I have, most likely. So when you're writing about or introducing a film, do you find it difficult? I mean, firstly, I was going to ask you what your favorite film is, which is always a trick question, and I apologize for it in advance.
But what if it's not got Norma Shearer in?
I know, right? It's so hard. So I was going to ask what your favorite film is. And then I was going to ask, do you find it hard writing or introducing films that you particularly love? Because I find that quite challenging, actually.
I mean, it's interesting, actually. I'm always drawn to things that are a little bit difficult sometimes, you know. My first audio commentary that I did recently, I'm working on my second one, but my first one was for a B picture. Like, no offense to anyone, I mean, it's out there, so Escape in the Fog, an hour-long B picture from 1945, it is not a great film. And it was sort of fascinating to start in and say, right, okay, so we're going to see this one shot of the bridge used 3 times. They're going to recycle all the sets. The leading man is a bit dull, but what do we have to say about it? I think when a film is truly great, if you're you know, talking about, you know, the great big, you know, you're talking about Citizen Kane or something, it's hard to know where to begin. I wrote about a very lovely film this morning and had 1,500 words, and it was just like 3,000 words too few, really. I'm happy to always share my enthusiasm for something. What I always try to think about when I'm writing or introducing a film, writing on or introducing a film, is that my primary job is not to show people everything that I know about the film or that I could look up about the film. My primary job is to communicate, and particularly when you're introducing a film, I could read off the list of the cast and their birth and death dates. I could give a little summary of what they've all been in, but no one's going to remember that because it's just so many facts. So if I can structure my introduction around a few key areas, people walk away and say, I didn't know it had a blues soundtrack, or I didn't know that, or, you know, the best thing to do is to find things in the film and talk about them, just lead them almost up to that particular detail so that when they watch it in the film, they'll make the connection themselves and they'll see, I noticed that. I mean, the classic example I use, and this is the simplest, is, I mean, it's very gossipy, but if you tell someone that a couple fell in love during the film, like the co-stars, they're gonna feel like they've discovered that for themselves when they watch the film. You know, if you say that the classic final shot was inspired by XYZ, when they see it, you don't need to tell them that it looks like a movie theatre. You know what I mean? You know, drop in a few quotes. There are often like a few obvious facts to say about the film, and you should never neglect them in an introduction, because people will come up to you afterwards and say, when was it made? But you know, you do have the leisure to go into the things that really interest you. Yeah, I mean, I suppose it's always important to remember that you're not writing or speaking the definitive truth on a film. You're giving people one experience.
Yeah, No, I think that's a really nice point. And that's really interesting. I always feel a little bit like, you know, like a soccer mom when I'm kind of introducing a film I particularly love, especially with Norma. So that's an interesting perspective. Thank you for that. And I think it's about quarter to two. So I think we'll have to kind of wrap up this session here. Pamela, as you know, we do have a brief kind of follow-up session for the journalism SOC students and for the MA students. But I wanted to thank you very, very much for this presentation and for your brilliant answers to the questions. And yeah, I really hope that our audience enjoyed it, and I think they did. All right, thank you very much.
Thank you.